As we first began, as the founding members of the African Philanthropy Forum came together, what they wanted in the very beginning was a snapshot of African philanthropy as it stands today. And so we turned to James Mwangi. Now, you need to know there are two James Mwangis. There is James Mwangi of Equity Bank, who has been an active participant in the Global Philanthropy Forum from its very beginning, I have to say, and has been a founding member of the African Philanthropy Forum. So we will be hearing from that James Mwangi later today. But there's another James Mwangi, and that's the James Mwangi of Dalberg Group. And we turned to James to ask him to undertake the analysis that we needed to see as a group of where African philanthropy stands today. So please join me in welcoming this James Mwangi.
Honorable guests, it's a pleasure to stand in front of you, but also a challenge in that I've been asked, as Jane said, to say a little bit about African philanthropy to the people who do constitute African philanthropy. And so in a sense, very little of what I'm saying is new to you, because if it's true, then it must be material that you already recognize and know from your own lives and your own activity. However, I'll try and offer a little bit of a summary of some of what we have observed at Dalberg through our work with a range of partners, many of whom I see here present in the room. And you know yourselves, I won't even begin to enumerate them, save to note that some of the research that we've done lately on the phenomenon of African philanthropy, how it's emerging, evolving, and transitioning, has come through both work with Jane and the team at the African Philanthropy Forum, as well as work with the Africa Grantmakers Network, funded by the Rockefeller Foundation, and other work that we've undertaken on our own to better understand what was happening with regard to social change across Africa. So, our very first slide, what is Dalberg? We are a strategy consulting firm focused on making a more inclusive and sustainable world. We work with businesses, philanthropies, governments across the developing world and developed countries, and a lot of our work focuses particularly in Africa. I have the good fortune and the privilege to currently lead the firm, and my own passion for Africa's transformation has found a real outlet in understanding the way in which African philanthropists are increasingly playing a role in the transformation of the continent. So it's a very interesting and deeply personal conversation to be a part of. The first thing that I struggle with when talking about African philanthropy is really defining it. It takes very many different forms, and it's nothing new to the African continent. Right? People have been giving and aggregating resources towards social causes since the beginning of time. And cultures of generosity and giving are so deeply embedded in the religious and traditional background of every African community that to come and talk about it as something new or something emerging feels dishonest. But we try to put a little bit of structure around the forms that philanthropy takes, because indeed the forms differ and the forms are evolving, and that has implications for how we act going forward. Very broadly speaking, we try to distinguish between individual philanthropy. This is private and individually controlled. It looks very much like philanthropy that people think of in their heads when the word is brought up. And it is an emerging aspect of philanthropy in Africa, although perhaps not the most common or visible one. There's also mobilized giving. So it's not the one or two well-to-do people making gifts, but rather individuals getting together small amounts in pursuit of a greater objective. And then you have community-based giving, where it's not just about gathering money to some cause, maybe drought relief in response to a crisis, but it's rather addressing a specific and immediate and pressing community need. And cutting across all of these is this idea that philanthropy is not just about money. It can be about time, it can be about other resources, influence. We heard earlier about the roles that, about examples of specific philanthropic action that involved going out there and implementing and applying your skills to address an issue. Now, as you look across these categories, a few things become clear. The first is that individual philanthropy is probably, at this point, the smallest of these categories if you look across Africa and what happens in Africa itself. But it's also the one with the potential to be most influential in a number of ways. And I'll drill into that in the next slide. When we looked at what is happening with individual philanthropy in Africa, we found, first of all, that it was tremendously difficult to come to very great specificity. The chart you see in front of you has the potential to be a bit confusing because it's trying to convey two things. It involves looking across all of the published data we were able to find in any newspaper, magazine, article, website, etc., about individual philanthropy in Africa, published gifts or commitments. The bars indicate the number of examples of philanthropists that we were able to identify. And above them are numbers indicating the amounts. And you see that across Africa, whether you're in Central Africa, East Africa, Southern Africa, there is no place where we found no examples of active philanthropists. But we also found that it was tremendously difficult to figure out how much was being given and to what. The numbers, as you can see, the most available number was for Southern Africa. That number is very high. It probably reflects the fact that there's a lot of philanthropic activity in Southern Africa, but it also reflects the fact that there's a lot more formalized giving in Southern Africa. In total, we identified 110 examples of published individual philanthropy of a certain scale, and the total commitments went well over $800 million. Now, some of this is stretched over several years, some of it is compressed. In the last year since this analysis was done, more contributions have been made, and indeed it seems to be accelerating. Now, we need to recognize that not only are African philanthropists, and that $800 million number outweighed by the other categories of giving, whether it's in the Harambes of Kenya or the church contributions or the mobilized contributions that happen in every part of Africa. But they're also a relatively small pool compared to the foreign pools of resources or non-African pools of resources that come in for philanthropic purpose. So when we talk about African philanthropy and the role of the African Philanthropy Forum, it needs to be within the context of leverage. How can a relatively small but concentrated group of people exercise influence both across the continent and beyond the continent in a way that promotes positive social impact? A few trends that emerged when we looked across the data on philanthropy. Firstly, it'll come as no news to you that there's a very high premium on privacy for most high net worth individuals in Africa. And it makes it very, very, very difficult to actually get tangible information on who is giving, how much they're giving, and why. It is laudable in that people are trying to be modest, and it is in keeping with many of our cultures, but it does create a challenge. Secondly, a lot of the giving in the past, or until recently, has been characterized largely by informal channels, or has happened through traditional or religious mechanisms. What this has meant is that you very seldom have an African philanthropist say, I am targeting these issues for the following reason with the following objectives. That may be very clear in their minds, but it's not necessarily clearly articulated to the outside world. And that has implications as well that we will come to. The other interesting point is that many of the new philanthropists that we identified were entrepreneurs and businessmen who were still active in that aspect of their lives today. And frankly, very many of them failed to see a clear distinction or see the value in distinguishing between the work they were doing to build their businesses and the work they were doing for social good. And whether that manifested in socially impactful business on their business side, or a very investment-oriented approach to philanthropy in their philanthropic side, what you saw was a continuum rather than a clear divide between what you do as a philanthropist and what you do as an entrepreneur. To me, that is exciting. It mirrors what is slowly happening in the rest of the world and suggests that African philanthropy can start from a very different place and probably achieve a very different profile and impact. Now, the implications of this are the deliberately low visibility of African philanthropists does limit their ability to influence others to give or to coordinate their activity with others. If we recognize that leverage is what we're looking for, it becomes very hard to have leverage when you can't have influence. And you can't have influence if people don't know what you're doing. And so that is a challenge. How do you reconcile the need for privacy with the need for clarity of strategy and the ability to coordinate? The same point around whether you articulate a strategy and how do you get that out there so that people can align around you and work with you. But then the exciting piece, as I alluded to already, is if you're taking a more entrepreneurial view of how you drive social change, well, maybe the number that we should be focusing on is not your philanthropic contribution, but the full footprint that you have across your role as a business person, entrepreneur, advocate, and voice of different kinds. And really thinking about how you bring all of that to driving positive social change. So going forward, a few thoughts on how you can go, how African philanthropy can play a role. And these are just thoughts. I suspect others will have deeper thoughts. So intended as provocation and to get, put a view out there. Firstly, money is the least of the things that indigenous philanthropists can bring to the table. It's much more about influence, local knowledge, and an overall visibility that allows you to shape the conversation that's happening and to bring others together. Money is important, but it is necessary but not sufficient. As recognized role models, leading philanthropists can affect broader social attitudes towards giving. So at the same time as you're bringing your particular knowledge or insight, or you're using your influence with actors in government, among other corporates, etc., there's another aspect of what philanthropists are doing, which is shaping the way that the average person on the street thinks about how they engage with social challenges in society. And indeed, there's a great opportunity, particularly as Africa continues to grow and we see a new wave of prosperity, for the African Philanthropy Forum and philanthropists across the continent to say that it's not just about getting and spending, it's most importantly about giving. Those still involved in business can show how the intersection of philanthropy and entrepreneurship can create new opportunities for growth and impact. We've touched on that already. And by partnering with others from within the continent and beyond, African philanthropists can be a great new anchor for driving change at scale. The reality is very, very often what's lacking in attempts to attack development challenges is a combination of local knowledge, networks, and influence. At the same time, what many indigenous philanthropists lack is the sheer scale of funding to materially move the needle on a major social challenge. A few $1 million isn't going to address childhood mortality in a large African country. However, if you can affect how billions of dollars are spent, you can move that needle. Finally, I think that as the culture of more visible philanthropy in Africa takes root, it can both contribute to and benefit from the learning about the future of philanthropy that is happening around the world. I think the fact that we are starting off a new chapter in talking about African philanthropy allows us a little bit of freedom to develop indigenously African models, talk about them openly, and essentially advocate for a new way of thinking about how we combine prosperity and purpose for a meaningful impact in the future. Thank you very much, and I hope that this gathering proves a great jumping off point for exactly that conversation.